A storm rages, a wounded puppy clings to life, and a tearful dog's desperate trust ignites a healer's redemption in the desert. Welcome to Pause Vive. Subscribe and share the video with those who need love. The desert dawn was still a whisper of pink and gold over the red rock mesas when Elias Dawnwalker stepped onto his porch, the familiar weight of his coffee mug grounding him against the chill. The high desert of northern Arizona stretched before his cabin, a vast canvas of rust-colored earth and gnarled juniper trees, their dark silhouettes softened by a morning mist that clung stubbornly to the ground. The air carried the sharp tang of wet sage, a reminder of the monsoon rains that had swollen the arroyos and turned dirt roads to impassable mud. Elias inhaled deeply, savoring the solitude he'd carved out here, 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, where the only sounds were the distant call of a canyon wren and the soft creak of his boots on the weathered pine boards. He'd chosen this isolation 4 years ago. After Syria had left its scars, both the visible one snaking from his right eyebrow to his jaw and the invisible ones that woke him at 3 a.m., heart pounding with the ghosts of lives he couldn't save. As a Navy corpsman, he'd been a lifeline. In chaos, his hands steady under gunfire, but those same hands now betrayed him with a faint tremor each morning as he gripped his mug. This cabin, perched on a rise overlooking a dry creek bed, demanded nothing from him. No questions about the nightmares, no pitying glances at his scar, no expectations to be the healer he'd once promised his Navajo grandmother he'd become. Here he could simply exist, nursing his wounds in the quiet company of the desert. But this morning something pierced the stillness, a sound that wasn't a whimper or a howl, but something rawer, more primal, that crawled under Elias's skin and lodged there like shrapnel. He froze, coffee forgotten, his dark eyes scanning the mist. The sound came again, softer now, from the direction of the juniper grove that marked the edge of his property. Instinct, honed by years in combat zones, kicked in. He set the mug on the porch rail and stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel path. There, barely 10 feet away, a shadow emerged from the fog. A Labrador Retriever, her golden coat matted and dulled by grime, stood trembling in the dawn light. She was so thin her ribs jutted like the slats of a broken fence, her legs unsteady from exhaustion. But it wasn't her frail condition that stopped Elias's breath cold in his chest. It was her eyes, hazel pools, wide and glistening, with tears streaming down her muzzle, darkening the red earth beneath her in tiny, mournful rivulets. The sight was so human, so impossibly raw that Elias felt the world tilt beneath him. Clutched gently in her jaws, hanging limp as a discarded rag, was a puppy, no bigger than Elias's 2 hands side by side. Its fur was matted with blood and mud, one tiny ear torn, its small body motionless except for the faint sway as the mother dog took a cautious step forward. Her eyes locked with Elias's, and in that moment something passed between them, something ancient, wordless, and heavy, with trust. She took 3 more deliberate steps, her gaze never wavering, and with a tenderness that made Elias's throat tighten, she lowered her head and placed the puppy at his feet. The mother dog backed away, her movements stiff but purposeful, and sat on her haunches, her tear-streaked face fixed on Elias. She didn't growl, didn't flinch, but her hazel eyes held an intensity that felt like a plea, as if she'd crossed deserts and dodged storms to deliver her dying child to this one man, this one chance. The puppy lay still, a small broken thing against the coarse dirt, and Elias's heart thudded painfully, memories of bloodied soldiers flashing behind his eyes. He knelt slowly, his scarred hand hovering over the tiny body, afraid to touch. Afraid to confirm what he already suspected. "Hold on, little one," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse, barely audible above the desert's quiet hum. The mother dog's ears flicked at his words, her body tense as a drawn bow, but she remained still, trusting him with the weight of her hope. Elias's fingers brushed the puppy's side, and there, faint as a whisper, he felt the barest flutter of breath. It was enough to jolt him from his hesitation, to pull him back to the man he'd been before the war had hollowed him out. He looked up at the Labrador, her tearful eyes still locked on his, and something cracked inside him, a fault line in the walls he'd built to keep the world at bay. "I'll try," he said to her, not caring how it might sound to speak to a dog as if she understood. "That's all I can promise." With careful reverence, he scooped the puppy into his arms, cradling it against his chest like he once held wounded comrades, and turned toward the cabin. The mother dog followed to the edge of the porch, where she sat, sentinel-like, her gaze fixed on the door as the first drops of a new rain began to fall. Inside, Elias's solitary world felt suddenly too small for the life in his hands, too quiet for the trust the mother dog had placed in him. He glanced out the window, where her silhouette remained, unwavering despite the gathering storm. This wasn't just a stray seeking shelter. This was something more, something that demanded he step back into the role he'd sworn to leave behind. And for the first time in years, Elias Dawnwalker felt the stirrings of purpose, fragile but undeniable, in the heartbeat of a puppy and the tearful eyes of its mother. Elias Dawnwalker stood in the dim light of his cabin, the puppy cradled in his arms, its faint warmth seeping through his flannel shirt. The familiar scent of pine and old leather filled the small space, but it felt foreign now, invaded by the weight of this unexpected responsibility. Outside, the rain had begun to fall in earnest, a soft patter against the tin roof that underscored the silence between Elias and the tiny life he held. His hands, once steady enough to suture wounds under the scream of mortars, trembled slightly as he laid the puppy on a clean towel atop his kitchen table. The sight of its blood-matted fur and torn ear sent a jolt of memory through him. Images of soldiers broken and bleeding, their eyes pleading for him to pull them back from the edge. He shook his head, forcing the past back into its cage. "Not now," he muttered, his voice a low growl in the quiet. The puppy's chest rose and fell, each breath a fragile thread, and Elias's gaze flicked to the window. Through the rain-streaked glass, he saw the Labrador Retriever, Maya, sitting, vigil on the porch, her hazel eyes still glistening with what he could only call tears, bored into him with an intensity that felt almost human. She hadn't moved, hadn't sought shelter under the eaves, as if her only purpose was to watch and wait. The trust in her stare was a blade, cutting through the walls he'd built to keep the world at bay. Elias turned back to the puppy, his jaw tightening. He wanted to walk away, to leave this problem for someone else, someone who hadn't sworn off healing after Syria, someone who didn't wake each night with the ghost of Private Ramirez's final, trusting gaze. 4 years ago, he'd been a different man, a Navy corpsman with a fire in his chest, driven by his grandmother's stories of Navajo healers who carried the gift of mending broken spirits. He'd enlisted with hope, believing he could honor her legacy. But war had burned that hope to ash, leaving him with scars and a certainty that his hands were better suited to holding coffee mugs than lives. Yet here he was, staring at a puppy who needed him to be that man again. "Damn it," he whispered, running a hand through his dark hair, still damp from the morning mist. He could call the sheriff, let animal control handle it. He could pretend he hadn't seen the tears in Maya's eyes or felt the faint pulse beneath his fingers. But even as the thought formed, it crumbled under the weight of her gaze, still fixed on him through the window. She'd brought her puppy to him, not to the town veterinarian or a random doorstep. Why? The question gnawed at him, stirring a curiosity he hadn't felt in years. He knelt beside the table, his scarred hand hovering over the puppy's small body. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" he said softly, his voice catching on the words. The puppy didn't stir, but its breathing seemed steadier now, or perhaps that was just his own hope talking. Elias glanced at Maya again, her silhouette, blurred by the rain but unwavering. "Your mama didn't give up on you, guess I can't either." With a deep breath, he stood and moved to the corner of the cabin where he kept his old medical kit, a relic he hadn't touched since moving. Here. The canvas bag was dusty, its zipper stiff from disuse, but opening it was like stepping back into a life he'd tried to forget. Gauze, antiseptic, a small syringe, tools of a trade he'd abandoned. His fingers brushed the worn leather of his old corpsman patch, and a pang of guilt twisted in his chest. He'd promised his grandmother he'd be a healer, not a hermit, hiding from his own shadow. Elias carried the kit to the table and began assessing the puppy with the clinical precision of his training. Severe dehydration, hypothermia, a deep laceration on the hind leg and that gunshot wound, small, round and deliberate, hidden beneath the matted fur. The realization hit like a punch. Someone had shot this puppy, left it to die in the desert. Anger flared, hot and unfamiliar, burning away the numbness he'd cultivated. "Who does this?" he muttered, his hands moving faster now, cleaning the wound with careful strokes. As he worked, he spoke to the puppy, his voice low and steady, the way he used to calm wounded soldiers. "You're gonna make it, little warrior. Your mama brought you here for a reason." The words felt strange, like speaking a language he'd forgotten, but they anchored him, kept the ghosts at bay. He glanced out the window every few minutes, checking on Maya. She hadn't budged, her golden coat soaked through, her eyes twin flames in the grey dawn. Her presence was a tether, pulling him deeper into this moment, this act of trying to save something when he'd convinced himself he was done saving anything. The rain intensified, a desert downpour that turned the dirt to mud and drummed against the cabin like a heartbeat. Elias wrapped the puppy in a warmed towel, his hands steadier now, driven by a purpose he hadn't felt since before the war. He didn't know if he could save this tiny life, but Maya's trust demanded he try. And in that trying, something stirred within him, a flicker of the man he'd been, the healer who believed in second chances. He stepped to the door, cracking it open against the storm. Maya's head lifted, her ears pricking forward, water streaming from her muzzle. "Your pup's still fighting," he called, his voice carrying over the rain. "I'm not giving up if you're not." She blinked slowly, then lowered her head to her paws, as if acknowledging his promise. The gesture, so deliberate, sent a shiver down Elias's spine. This wasn't just a stray dog. There was something more to her, something that felt like fate knocking on his door. Closing the door, Elias returned to the puppy, his mind racing. He needed help, more than his old kit could provide. The nearest vet was in town, but the flooded roads made the trip impossible. There was only one person he could call, someone he hadn't spoken to in 2 years, someone who might still answer despite the way he'd pushed her away. His hand hesitated over the phone, but Maya's tearful eyes and the puppy's faint breaths left him no choice. He had to act, even if it meant opening a door he'd sworn to keep shut. Elias Dawnwalker's hands moved with mechanical precision as he cleaned the puppy's gunshot wound, the antiseptic's sharp scent mingling with the cabin's familiar musk of pine and leather. The rain hammered the tin roof, a relentless rhythm that seemed to echo the pulse of his own memories, stirring them from the shadows where he'd buried them. Each swipe of gauze over the puppy's matted fur pulled him further from the present, back to a place he'd spent 4 years trying to outrun. Syria, 2017, a dusty outpost where the air tasted of smoke and fear. The puppy's faint whimpers became the labored breaths of Private Ramirez, a 19-year-old Marine whose life had slipped through Elias's fingers like sand. He was 25 then, a Navy corpsman with the 3rd Marine Division, his Navajo heritage a quiet source of pride amidst the chaos of war. His grandmother, a revered Hatawi, had seen the healer's gift in him as a boy, teaching him the stories of the holy people and the sacred balance of Hojo. "Your hands will mend what's broken, Elias," she'd said, her voice steady, as the desert itself. "But only if you carry courage in your heart." He'd enlisted with that courage, believing he could honor her legacy by saving lives in the crucible of combat. Syria had tested that belief, forging him into a man who could stitch wounds under gunfire, who could shout orders over the roar of mortars, who could keep his hands steady even when his heart raced. But Ramirez had been different. The memory surged now, vivid and unyielding, as Elias adjusted the towel beneath the puppy. It was a routine patrol outside Raqqa, the sun a merciless blaze overhead, when the sniper's bullet found Ramirez. The kid, always cracking jokes, always carrying a photo of his little sister, had taken the round center mass just above his plate. Elias was at his side in seconds, his medical kit open, his hands moving with the precision of training. "Stay with me, Ramirez," he'd said, pressing gauze against the wound, blood soaking through faster than he could stem it. "You're gonna see your sister again." Ramirez's eyes, wide with fear, had locked onto Elias's, trusting him to make good on that promise. Elias worked frantically, plasma, pressure, airway clear, but the blood wouldn't stop, pooling beneath. The Marine's body, staining the dust red. "Tell her I wasn't scared," Ramirez whispered, his voice fading as his gaze grew distant, shifting from fear to a strange acceptance that haunted Elias still. He'd died there, in the dirt, his hand limp in Elias's grip, leaving Elias, with a failure that no amount of training could erase. The inquiry had cleared him, proper procedures followed, unavoidable casualty, but the words meant nothing. He was Ramirez's corpsman, his lifeline, and he'd failed. The scar on his face, earned in a later IED blast, was a visible reminder, but the deeper wound was the guilt that followed him home. He returned to Arizona a shadow of the bright-eyed boy who'd enlisted, his grandmother's dreams of him as a healer buried under the weight of his shame. He'd chosen this cabin, this isolation, to escape the expectation of saving anyone, to silence the nightmares that replayed Ramirez's final moments. Here he could be nothing more than a man who bought supplies once a week, nodded politely in town, and kept his distance from the world. Elias's hands paused over the puppy, the gauze trembling slightly in his grip. The memory of Ramirez's eyes merged with the puppy's stillness, with Maya's tearful gaze outside. He glanced at the window where the Labrador Retriever remained, her soaked form a golden blur through the rain. Her trust was a mirror, reflecting the man he'd been, the healer who'd once believed he could mend what was broken. "I couldn't save him," he whispered, the words slipping out unbidden, meant for no one but the ghosts in his head. The puppy stirred. A faint twitch of its paw, and Elias's focus snapped back. He set the gauze aside and checked the wound, his hands steadier now, driven by a need he couldn't name. This wasn't Syria, and this puppy wasn't Ramirez, but the stakes felt just as high. Maya had crossed miles, maybe more, to bring her child to him, defying every instinct of a wild dog to seek human help. He didn't understand why, but the why didn't matter, not yet. What mattered was the life beneath his hands, fragile but fighting, and the mother dog who believed he could make a difference. He reached for the syringe, drawing a small dose of antibiotics from his kit. "You're not giving up, little warrior," he said, his voice soft but firm, the same tone he'd used to coax soldiers through pain. As he administered the dose, he felt a shift, a crack in the armor he'd worn since returning home. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was something. Close, a willingness to try to step back into the role he'd abandoned. Maya's eyes, still watching through the window, seemed to see it too, her posture unwavering despite the storm's fury. Elias wrapped the puppy in another warmed towel, checking its pulse again. Stronger now, but still too weak to call it safe. He needed more than his old kit could offer, and the flooded roads meant he couldn't get to town. There was only one option, one person who might help, but calling her meant facing a different kind of past. Lena Starbloom, the veterinarian who'd once loved him, who'd seen his potential before he'd pushed her away. His hand hovered. Over the phone, the weight of that decision heavier than the puppy in his arms. But Maya's trust and the puppy's faint breaths left no room for retreat. Elias Dawnwalker worked with a focus that felt both foreign and familiar, his hands moving over the puppy with the precision of a man who'd once thrived under pressure. The cabin's single bulb cast a warm glow across the kitchen table, where the tiny creature lay on a clean towel, its bloodied fur now partially cleaned, revealing the stark reality of the gunshot wound. The rain outside had settled into a steady drum against the tin roof, a counterpoint to the faint, irregular breaths of the puppy Elias had begun to think of as a fighter. Beyond the window, Maya, the Labrador Retriever, remained a steadfast shadow on the porch, her hazel eyes fixed on the door, her tear-streaked muzzle glistening in the dim light. Her presence was a quiet command, urging Elias to act, to bridge the gap between the man he'd been and the one he'd become. He set the syringe aside, the antibiotics now coursing through the puppy's system, and leaned closer to examine the wound. The entry point was small, a .22 caliber by his estimation, but the damage beneath the surface was anyone's guess. Dehydration and hypothermia were immediate threats, but internal bleeding or infection could turn this fragile hope to ash. His old medical kit, a relic from his corpsman days, was equipped for battlefield trauma, not veterinary care, yet it was all he had. Elias warmed another towel in the microwave, wrapping it gently around the puppy to raise its core temperature, his fingers brushing the torn ear as he worked. "Hang in there, little warrior," he murmured, the words a lifeline for both of them. As he adjusted the towel, Elias's gaze caught on Maya again. She hadn't moved, her golden coat plastered against her emaciated frame by the rain, her posture rigid, yet strangely disciplined. He squinted, noticing something he'd missed in the urgency of the moment, a faded scar running along her left flank, long and well-healed, not the kind of mark a stray would carry. It reminded him of the military working dogs he'd treated in Syria, their bodies bearing the evidence of service, their eyes sharp with training. Maya's gaze held that same intensity, and when he'd raised his hand earlier, a subtle shift in her stance had suggested she recognized the gesture. Could she be one of those dogs, retired and lost to the wild? The thought stirred a mix of awe and unease, deepening his resolve to save her puppy. Elias stepped back, assessing his next move. The puppy needed fluids, but his kit lacked a proper IV setup for something so small. He improvised, using a syringe to drip sugar water onto the puppy's tongue, watching for any sign of response. A faint lick, barely perceptible, sent a surge of hope through him, but it wasn't enough. The wound needed proper cleaning, and he needed supplies. Sutures, a broader spectrum antibiotic, maybe even imaging to check for bullet fragments. The flooded arroyos made a trip to town impossible, and the nearest vet was Lena Starbloom, a name that carried its own weight of regret. He glanced at the phone on the counter, its silence a reminder of the life he'd left behind. Lena had been more than a friend. Once she'd been the one who saw past his scars, who believed in the healer he could still be. But after Syria, he'd pushed her away, unable to bear her hope when he'd lost his own. Calling her now meant admitting he needed help, meant risking the vulnerability he'd spent years avoiding. Yet Maya's unwavering trust, her tearful eyes staring through the storm, made the choice clear. He couldn't do this alone, not if he wanted to keep his promise to her. Elias picked up the phone, his thumb hesitating over the keys. He scrolled to Lena's number, unchanged since their last call 2 years ago, when he'd told her he needed space, not realizing he was building a fortress instead. His heart thudded, not from fear of danger, but from the quieter terror of reaching out. He pressed call, the line ringing once, twice, 3 times, before a familiar voice answered, cool and professional. "Starbloom Veterinary Clinic, this is Lena." "Lena, it's Elias Dawnwalker," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. The silence that followed stretched long enough to make him think she'd hung up. When she spoke, her tone was guarded but not unkind. "Elias, it's been a while. What's wrong?" He took a breath, glancing at the puppy, then at Maya outside. "I've got a puppy here. Gunshot wound, critical condition. The mother brought it to my door this morning. So I've stabilized it as best I can, but I need help. The roads are flooded. I can't get to you." He didn't mention Maya's tears, couldn't find the words to explain the impossible trust in her eyes. Another pause, then a sigh. "Gunshot? That's okay. Text me a list of what you need. I'll see what I can do about the roads." Her voice softened slightly. "What about the mother? Is she hurt?" "She's malnourished, limping, but she's still here waiting. Won't leave the porch." Elias hesitated, then added, "She's special, Lena. I think she might be a military dog." "Military?" Lena's tone sharpened with interest. "All right, keep them both alive until I get there. I'm bringing someone who might help." She hung up before he could ask who, leaving Elias with the hum of the disconnected line and a flicker of relief. Help was coming, even if it meant facing Lena and the past he'd tried to bury. He returned to the puppy, checking its pulse again. Still, weak but holding. He adjusted the warmed towel, his hands steadier now, fueled by the knowledge that he wasn't alone in this fight. Outside, Maya lifted her head, as if sensing the shift, her eyes meeting his through the window. "Help's on the way," he called softly, the words carrying a promise he meant to keep. She blinked, slow and deliberate, then settled back into her vigil, her trust a beacon in the storm. Elias sat beside the table, his gaze drifting between the puppy and Maya. The cabin, once a refuge from responsibility, now felt alive with purpose, its walls echoing with the faint hope of redemption. He didn't know if he could save the puppy or what Maya's story held, but for the first time in years, he was willing to try. And that, he realized, was a start. Elias Dawnwalker sat by the kitchen table, his eyes flicking between the fragile puppy wrapped in a warm towel and the rain-soaked figure of Maya, the Labrador Retriever, still holding vigil on the porch. The cabin's walls seemed to hum with the weight of the moment, the storm outside a relentless drumbeat that matched the faint pulse beneath his fingers as he checked the puppy's condition. The antibiotics and sugar water had bought time, but time was a currency running low. The gunshot wound, though cleaned, was a lurking threat, and Elias's makeshift medical kit was no match for the surgery this tiny fighter needed. Lena's promise to bring help was a lifeline, but the flooded arroyos and the ghosts of their past made her arrival feel like a gamble against the storm. He glanced at the phone, its screen dark since their call, and felt a knot of unease. Reaching out to Lena Starbloom had been like cracking open a door he'd bolted shut 2 years ago, when he'd walked away from her and the life they'd begun to imagine together. She'd seen the healer in him, the man his grandmother had prophesied, but after Syria he'd seen only failure. Pushing her away had been easier than admitting he was drowning in guilt. Now, with Maya's tearful trust and the puppy's life hanging in the balance, he needed her expertise, and maybe something more he wasn't ready to name. The rumble of an engine cut through the rain's rhythm, faint at first, then growing louder as headlights pierced the grey curtain outside. Elias stood, his heart thudding, with a mix of relief and apprehension. He opened the cabin door, the cold air sharp against his skin, and saw Lena's battered pickup navigating the muddy path, its tires slipping but holding. Behind it, an older Jeep followed, its driver obscured by the storm. Maya rose on the porch, her ears pricked, her hazel eyes tracking the vehicles with a wary intelligence that deepened Elias's suspicion about her past. Lena stepped out first, her thick black hair pulled into a practical braid, her high cheekbones catching the dim light as she slung a medical bag over her shoulder. She hadn't changed much, same steady stride, same dark eyes that could cut through pretense, but there was a guardedness now, a wall where warmth had once been. She nodded at Elias, her expression professional but cool. "Got your list?" she said, her voice clipped as she approached the porch. "Brought what I could, roads are a mess." "Thanks for coming," Elias replied, his words stiff, aware of the unspoken history hanging between them. Maya watched Lena closely, her body tense but not hostile, as if assessing whether this new human was friend or foe. Before Elias could say more, the Jeep's door opened and an older man emerged, his silver hair tied back, his weathered face calm despite the rain. He wore a denim jacket adorned with Navajo beadwork, and his presence seemed to carry the weight of the desert itself. "Elias Dawnwalker," the man greeted, his voice warm but firm, carrying over the storm. "I am Thomas Yazzie, elder and Heartwarming. Lena thought you might need more than medicine for what's happening here." He stepped onto the porch, his eyes taking in Maya, the puppy's faint form through the open door, and Elias himself, with a knowing gaze that felt like it saw through to his bones. Elias blinked, caught off guard. Thomas Yazzie was a name he'd heard growing up, a respected healer and keeper of Navajo traditions, someone his grandmother had spoken of with reverence. "Elder Yazzie," he said, inclining his head in respect. "I didn't expect you." "Lena said a dog brought her dying pup to your door," Thomas replied, his tone gentle but probing. "That's no small thing. Your grandmother, she'd say it's a sign, a call to the healing path she saw in you." His words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through Elias's defenses. He hadn't spoken of his grandmother's hopes since her passing, hadn't wanted to face how far he'd strayed from them. Lena brushed past her focus on the puppy as she entered the cabin, but her glance at Thomas suggested she'd brought him deliberately, not just for the animals but for Elias. "Let's see what we're dealing with," she said, setting her bag on the table and kneeling beside the puppy. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking vitals, her expression softening as she took in the tiny fighter's condition. "You did well to stabilize her, Elias. She's hanging on." Elias followed, grateful for the shift to action, but Thomas lingered by the door, watching Maya with quiet interest. The Labrador Retriever met his gaze, her posture shifting slightly. Less wary, more attentive, as if recognizing something in the elder's calm authority. "This one's seen much," Thomas said, crouching to offer his hand. Maya sniffed it, then sat back, her eyes flicking to Elias, as if to say her trust remained with him. "She's no ordinary stray," Thomas added. "Her spirit is strong, like yours, even if you've forgotten it." The words stung, stirring memories of his grandmother's teachings, but Elias pushed them aside, focusing on Lena's assessment. "The bullet's still in there," she said, her fingers gently probing the wound. "She needs surgery soon or infection will set in. I can do it here, but it's not ideal. We'll need a sterile field, good light, and a lot of luck." She glanced at Elias, a flicker of their old partnership in her eyes. "You up for assisting?" He nodded, the weight of her trust settling over him like a mantle. "Whatever you need." He turned to Thomas, who'd stepped inside, his presence grounding the room. "Can you keep an eye on Maya? She's protective." Thomas smiled, a glint of understanding in his eyes. "She and I will get along fine. She knows why she's here." He moved to the porch, speaking softly to Maya in a mix of Navajo and English, his voice a soothing cadence that seemed to ease her tension. As Lena unpacked her supplies, Elias felt the cabin transform. No longer a fortress of solitude, but a makeshift hospital, alive with purpose. Lena's expertise, Thomas's wisdom, and Maya's unwavering faith were threads weaving together, pulling him back toward a path he'd abandoned. He didn't know if they could save the puppy or what Maya's story held, but for the first time in years, he wasn't facing the fight alone. The cabin's air grew thick with purpose as Elias. Dawn Walker and Dr. Lena Starbloom prepared for the puppy's surgery, their movements a silent dance born of necessity. The single bulb overhead cast stark shadows across the kitchen table, now a makeshift operating theater, draped in sterile cloths from Lena's medical bag. The puppy, still wrapped in a warmed towel, lay at the center, her tiny chest rising and falling with fragile determination. Outside, the storm raged on, the rain a relentless roar against the tin roof, sealing the cabin in a cocoon of urgency. Maya, the Labrador Retriever, had followed Elder Thomas Yazzy's gentle coaxing, and now sat just inside the door, her hazel eyes locked on her puppy, her tear-streaked muzzle still damp from the rain. Her presence was a quiet force, a reminder of the trust that had brought them all here. Elias handed Lena a pair of surgical gloves, his hands steady despite the weight of the moment. "You sure we can do this here?" he asked, his voice low, mindful of the puppy's precarious state. Lena's eyes flicked up, her expression a mix of focus and resolve, the same look she'd worn years ago when they'd faced challenges together. "We don't have a choice," she replied, snapping on the gloves. "The bullet's lodged near her hindquarter. If we don't get it out, infection will kill her before the road's clear." She paused, softening slightly. "You've kept her alive this long, Elias. That's not nothing." Her words stirred a flicker of pride, quickly doused by the memory of Private Ramirez, whose life he hadn't saved. Elias pushed the thought aside, focusing on the task at hand. He rigged an extra lamp from his workshop, positioning it to flood the table with light, while Lena laid out her instruments, scalpel, forceps, sutures, each glinting with clinical promise. Elder Thomas sat near Maya, his weathered hands resting on his knees, his presence a steady anchor. He murmured softly to the Labrador, words in Navajo that seemed to calm her, though her eyes never left her puppy. As Lena began the procedure, making a precise incision around the wound, Elias assisted, handing her tools and monitoring the puppy's vitals. The work pulled him back to Syria, to field hospitals where every second was a race against death. But this was different. No mortars, no chaos, just the quiet intensity of saving one small life. Lena's voice broke his reverie. "The bullets, deeper than I thought. Looks like it fragmented. I'll need to work fast." Her brow furrowed, and Elias felt the stakes rise, a tightening in his chest that wasn't just about the puppy. He glanced at Maya, whose posture had shifted, her body, leaning forward, ears pricked as if she understood every word. Then he noticed something that made his breath catch. A subtle change in her stance, her head tilting in a way that mirrored the military working dogs he'd seen in Syria. During a lull in Lena's work, Elias extended his hand, palm down, fingers together, the signal for stay he'd learned from handlers. Maya's eyes snapped to his hand, her body stilling instantly, her training overriding her anxiety. "Lena," he said quietly. "She's responding to commands. She's—" "No stray, I think she's a retired military dog." Lena paused, her forceps hovering over the wound. "Military? That would explain the scar, her behavior." She met Elias's gaze, a spark of curiosity breaking through her focus. "If she's military, she's been through hell, just like—" She stopped, but Elias knew the unspoken words. "Just like you." The realization deepened his connection to Maya, her trust no longer just a mystery, but a shared language of survival. Thomas spoke from the corner, his voice calm but weighted. "She chose you, Elias. Animals like her, they know who carries the healer's spirit even when you hide from it." His words landed heavily, echoing his grandmother's prophecies, but Elias had no time to dwell. Lena's hands moved faster now, extracting a bullet fragment, her face tense with concentration. "One more piece," she muttered. "If I miss hit, she won't make it." The surgery stretched on, each minute a battle against the puppy's fading strength. Elias's hands stayed steady, passing instruments, applying suction, but his mind raced. If Maya was a military dog, her journey to his door was even more extraordinary. A trained soldier turned stray, crossing the desert to save her pup. Scar on her flank, her disciplined posture, her tears. They painted a story of loss and resilience that mirrored his own. He felt a surge of protectiveness, not just for the puppy, but for Maya, who'd placed her faith in him against all odds. Soft whine from Maya drew his attention. She'd risen, her nose pressed against the edge of the table, her eyes fixed on her puppy. Lena glanced up, her voice gentle but firm. "Maya, stay back. We're helping her." To Elias's astonishment, Maya obeyed, retreating to Thomas's side but never breaking her gaze. The moment cemented Elias's suspicion. Maya wasn't just trained. She was a veteran, her instincts honed by service, her trust in humans a miracle after whatever she'd endured. Lena finally extracted the last fragment, holding it up in the forceps, a small, mangled piece of metal that had nearly stolen a life. "Got it," she said, exhaling sharply. "Now to close the wound and pray she's strong enough." As she began suturing, Elias checked the puppy's pulse, weak but persistent, a testament to her fight. He looked at Maya, whose ears flicked forward as if sensing the shift. "Your girl's a warrior," he told her, the words carrying a promise he felt in his bones. But the stakes weren't just medical. If Maya was a military dog, her presence here raised questions. How had she ended up wild? And why had she chosen him? The answers could complicate things, especially in a town quick to fear strays. And Lena's arrival, Thomas's cryptic words about his healer's spirit. They were pulling Elias back toward a world he'd rejected, one where he couldn't hide from his past or his potential. The puppy's life hung in the balance, but so did something larger, something that felt like the beginning of redemption. The cabin was a crucible of tension, the air thick with the sterile tang of antiseptic and the relentless drumming of rain on the tin roof. Elias Dawnwalker stood at Lena Starbloom's side, his hands steady as he passed her sutures, their movements synchronized in the desperate rhythm of saving the puppy they'd named Hope. The kitchen table, transformed into a surgical field, held the tiny creature at its center, her chest barely rising under Lena's careful stitches. Elder Thomas Yazzie sat near the door, his presence a quiet anchor, while Maya, the Labrador Retriever, watched from a few feet away, her hazel eyes burning with an intensity that seemed to will her puppy to survive. The storm outside raged, sealing them in this moment, but within the cabin a different kind of storm was brewing, one that threatened to unravel everything. Lena tied off the final suture, her shoulders sagging with cautious relief. "Wounds closed," she said, her voice taut but steady. "No more bleeding, but she's still critical. The next few hours will tell us if she can fight off the infection." She stepped back, wiping her brow with the back of her glove, and Elias checked Hope's pulse. Faint, irregular, but there. He adjusted the warmed towel around her, his fingers brushing her torn ear, and whispered, "Keep fighting, little warrior." The words were as much for himself as for the puppy, a tether to the hope that had begun to flicker within him. Maya shifted, her ears pricking forward, as if sensing the fragile victory. Elias met her gaze, her tear-streaked muzzle now dry, but her eyes still carrying that impossible trust. Her military posture, the scar on her flank, the way she'd responded to his hand signal, all confirmed she was no ordinary stray. She was a veteran like him, her journey to his door a testament to a resilience he was only beginning to understand. But before he could share this with Lena, Hope's body twitched violently, her tiny limbs jerking in a sudden, uncontrolled spasm. "Seizure!" Lena snapped, dropping to her knees beside the table. She tilted Hope's head to keep her airway clear, her hands moving with practiced urgency. Elias's heart lurched, the cabin shrinking to the pinpoint of this crisis. He grabbed a syringe from Lena's bag, ready to administer medication, but Hope's spasms intensified, her chest stilling as the seizure gripped her. "She's not breathing," Lena said, her voice clinical but edged with fear. "Elias, start compressions." He leaned over Hope, his scarred hands pressing gently but firmly on her tiny chest. 1, 2, 3, pause, his training kicking in despite the panic clawing at him. Memories of Syria flooded back. Private Ramirez's blood-soaked chest, his fading pulse, the helpless rage of failure. "Not again," Elias growled, his voice barely audible over the storm. Lena injected a dose of anticonvulsant, her eyes locked on Hope, but the puppy remained limp, her heartbeat fading under Elias's fingers. Maya rose, a low whine escaping her throat, her body trembling as she paced closer. Thomas reached out, murmuring in Navajo, but Maya's focus was singular, her eyes fixed on her puppy. Elias intensified. His compressions, his world narrowing to the rhythm, 1, 2, 3, pause, but Hope didn't respond. "Come on, little warrior," he pleaded, his voice breaking. Lena checked for a pulse, shaking her head. "It's been 2 minutes, we're losing her." The words were a blade cutting through Elias's resolve. He saw Ramirez's face again, those trusting eyes fading to nothing, and the weight of another failure threatened to crush him. But then Maya moved, swift and deliberate, nudging Elias aside with her muzzle. He stumbled back, startled, as the Labrador stood over her puppy, her body radiating purpose. "Maya, no," he began, but Lena grabbed his arm, her eyes wide. "Wait, look." Maya lowered her head, licking Hope's chest with precise, forceful strokes, then pressed her nose firmly against the puppy's side, pushing with a strength that belied her malnourished frame. She repeated the motion twice, her movements almost ritualistic, before stepping back and letting out a sharp, commanding bark that echoed in the cabin like a call to battle. Elias held his breath, his heart pounding, as Hope's tiny body jerked. Once, then again. A ragged gasp broke the silence, her chest heaving as she drew a desperate breath, her pink tongue flickering weakly. "She's back," Lena breathed, already checking vitals. Heart rate's weak, but it's there. She loaded another syringe with medication from her bag, her hands shaking slightly as she administered it to stabilize Hope's breathing. Elias sank to his knees, his mind reeling. Maya had done what he and Lena couldn't, pulled her puppy back from the edge of death with an instinct that defied explanation. The Labrador settled beside Hope, her body curved protectively around her, her hazel eyes meeting Elias's with a quiet certainty, as if to say, "We're not done fighting." Thomas's voice broke the stunned silence, soft but resonant. Her spirit called to the holy people, and they answered. Your grandmother would say this is Hozho, Elias, balance restored through trust. Elias looked at the elder, his words stirring memories of his grandmother's teachings, but the weight of the crisis left no room for reflection. Hope's breathing was shallow, her condition still critical, and the storm outside showed no sign of easing, trapping them in this fragile moment. Lena adjusted the monitoring equipment, her face a mask of professional focus, but her voice betrayed her awe. I've never seen anything like that. She knew exactly what to do. She glanced at Elias, a flicker of their old connection sparking. "You were right about her. She's military, trained for more than just survival." Elias nodded, his gaze on Maya, whose intervention had shifted something fundamental within him. The puppy's survival wasn't just a medical victory. It was a challenge to the walls he'd built, a call to reclaim the healer he'd buried. But the crisis had raised the stakes higher than he'd imagined. If Maya was a military dog, her presence here could draw attention. Questions about her past, her legal status, even her safety, in a town quick to fear strays. And Hope's seizure, a possible sign of neurological damage, meant the fight was far from over. Elias felt the weight of responsibility settle over him, not just for the puppy, but for Maya, whose trust had ignited a purpose he couldn't ignore. The storm's fury had softened to a steady drizzle by midday, the cabin's windows streaked with rivulets that blurred the red rock mesas beyond. Inside, Elias Dawnwalker sat on the floor near the wood stove, where Hope, the tiny puppy, rested in a nest of blankets, her breathing shallow but steady after the harrowing seizure. Lena Starbloom adjusted the monitoring equipment, her movements precise despite the exhaustion etched into her face. Maya, the Labrador Retriever, lay curled protectively around her puppy, her hazel eyes vigilant, her military posture softened by maternal devotion. Elder Thomas Yazzie stood by the window, his silver hair catching the dim light as he watched the receding clouds, his presence a quiet bridge between the cabin's intensity and the world outside. The air held a fragile hope, but beneath it, a new tension simmered, stirred by the miracle of Hope's survival and the questions it raised about Maya's past. Elias's hands, still dusted with antiseptic, rested on his knees, his mind replaying Maya's astonishing intervention. Her precise licks, her commanding bark had pulled Hope back from death's edge, a feat that defied Lena's veterinary science and echoed Thomas's talk of hoj-ho, balance restored. But the victory was bittersweet. Hope's seizure hinted at deeper damage, and Maya's confirmed military background complicated their fragile sanctuary. Elias glanced at Lena, who met his eyes with a mix of awe and concern. "She's stable for now," Lena said, her voice low to avoid disturbing Hope. "But we need to watch for more seizures. And Maya, we need to figure out who she is, legally. Military dogs aren't just strays you can claim." Before Elias could respond, the distant rumble of tires on gravel cut through the drizzle's patter. He stood, his body tensing, and moved to the window. 3 vehicles approached, a sheriff's patrol car leading 2 pickup trucks, their mud-splattered frames familiar from town. "Trouble," Elias muttered, his hand instinctively brushing Maya's head. She rose, her ears pricked, her posture shifting to the alert stance of a trained soldier. Thomas turned from the window, his weathered face calm but alert. "The town talks fast," he said. "Word of a military dog spreads like wildfire." Lena joined Elias at the door, her medical bag slung over her shoulder, ready to defend her. "Patience." "Let me handle this," she said, her tone firm but laced with worry. Elias nodded, but his jaw tightened, a protective instinct flaring for Maya and Hope. He opened the door, stepping onto the porch as Sheriff Martinez exited the patrol car, his tan Stetson tilted against the drizzle. Behind him, 2 ranchers, Bill Torres and his son Caleb, a lanky 16-year-old with a hunting rifle slung casually over his shoulder, climbed out of the pickups, their faces set with suspicion. "Morning, Elias," Sheriff Martinez called, his voice even but carrying authority. "Dr. Starbloom, Elder Yazzie. Got reports of a dangerous animal out here. Military-trained Labrador, possibly feral. County's got concerns about public safety." His eyes flicked to Maya, who stood at Elias's side, her gaze steady, no trace of aggression but a clear readiness. "She's not feral," Elias said, his voice low and controlled, though anger simmered beneath it. "She's a retired military dog, and she's under my protection. Her puppy's fighting for her life inside." He gestured toward the cabin, where Hope's faint form was visible through the open door. Caleb snorted, his grip tightening on the rifle. "Military or not, it's a stray. Been killing chickens, maybe even lambs. My dad's lost 3 this." Month? His tone was brash, but his eyes darted nervously to Maya, betraying something more than bravado. You got proof of that, Caleb? Lena stepped forward, her voice sharp with challenge. She held up a small evidence bag, revealing the bullet fragment she'd extracted from Hope. This is a .22 caliber, same as that rifle you're holding. Care to explain why it was in a puppy's leg? The accusation hung in the air, and Caleb's face paled, his bravado crumbling. Sheriff Martinez's expression darkened, his gaze shifting to the teen. That true, son? He asked, his voice low with suspicion. Bill Torres stepped in front of Caleb, his face reddening. You got no right accusing my boy, Starbloom. That dog's a threat and everyone in town's saying so. We want it gone. Elias's fists clenched, the memory of Maya's tearful trust fueling his resolve. She's not going anywhere. She brought her dying pup to me, trusted me to save. Her, you think that's what a threat does? His voice carried the weight of his own service, a corpsman's defiance against injustice. Thomas spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. This land is Dawn Walker's, recognized by treaty. You have no authority here, Sheriff, unless you bring proof of harm. His words, grounded in Navajo law, forced a pause, the sheriff's jaw tightening as he weighed his options. Caleb shifted, his rifle lowering slightly, but his eyes darted to Hope's nest inside. I didn't mean to shoot no puppy, he mumbled, the words slipping out before he could stop them. His father spun on him, but the damage was done. Sheriff Martinez's face hardened further. We'll talk about this, Caleb, at the station. The confrontation teetered on the edge of escalation, the drizzle turning to a light rain that mirrored the growing unrest. Lena's evidence and Thomas's legal stance had bought time, but Elias felt the deeper threat, the town's fear, stoked by rumors and loss, wouldn't fade easily. Maya's military past, once a badge of honor, now painted her as a danger in the eyes of those who didn't understand her loyalty. And Hope's fragile recovery hung in the balance, her next seizure, potentially fatal without constant care. Sheriff Martinez raised a hand, signaling retreat. No action today, he said, his tone final. But this ain't over, Elias. County rules are clear about strays, military or not. I'll be back with paperwork if the complaints keep coming. He guided Caleb to the patrol car, the ranchers, following reluctantly, their glares promising trouble ahead. As the vehicles retreated, Elias turned to Lena and Thomas, his heart pounding. They'll come back, he said, his voice low, and they'll have the law on their side. Lena nodded, her eyes on Maya, who'd returned to Hope's side. Then we need to protect them, legally, medically, whatever it takes. But first, we keep Hope alive. Thomas placed a hand on Elias's shoulder, his gaze steady. The truth will reveal itself, as it always does, but you must decide how far you'll go to defend what's yours. Elias looked at Maya and Hope, their bond a mirror to the purpose stirring within him. The community's fear was a new battle, one that threatened the fragile sanctuary he was building. But for the first time, he felt ready to fight, not just for them, but for the healer he might still become. The drizzle had settled into a soft mist, cloaking the cabin in a quiet that felt both fragile and sacred after the confrontation with Sheriff Martinez and the ranchers. Elias Dawnwalker stood on the porch, his breath visible in the cooling air, his eyes tracing the muddy tracks left by the retreating vehicles. Inside, Hope rested near the wood stove, her tiny body monitored by Lena Starbloom's steady hands, while Maya, the Labrador Retriever, lay protectively beside her, her hazel eyes calm but alert. Elder Thomas Yazzie sat in Elias's armchair, his weathered fingers tracing the beadwork on his jacket, his presence a grounding force amidst the storm's aftermath. The community's threat lingered like a shadow, but within Elias, a deeper shift was taking root, one that felt like the first cracks in a dam long holding back his truth. He stepped back inside, closing the door against the damp chill, and knelt beside Hope. Her breathing was steadier now, the anti-convulsant keeping seizures at bay, but her fragility was a stark reminder of how close they'd come to losing her. Maya lifted her head, her gaze meeting Elias's, and in those tear-streaked eyes he saw not just trust but a mirror to his own resilience, a veteran who'd survived her own wars to save her child. The confrontation with Caleb and the ranchers had crystallized something for Elias. Maya and Hope weren't just animals in his care. They were a call to reclaim the healer he'd buried after Syria. Lena glanced up from her equipment, her expression softening as she caught his intensity. "She's holding her own," she said, nodding toward Hope. "You did good out there. Standing up for them. Not everyone would." Her words carried a weight beyond the moment, a nod to the man she'd once known, the one who'd pushed her away rather than face his pain. Elias hesitated, his hand resting on Maya's head. Her warmth grounding him. "I didn't have a choice," he said quietly. "Not after what she did. Bringing Hope to me, saving her when we couldn't. She's like me, Lena, broken, but still fighting." The admission slipped out, raw and unfiltered, the first time he'd voiced the parallel aloud. Lena's eyes held his, a flicker of their old connection sparking. "You're not broken, Elias. Wounded maybe, but that's not the same thing." She set down her stethoscope, her voice gentle but insistent. "You told me once about Ramirez, but it's never the whole story. What happened to him? It's why you stopped healing, isn't it?" The question pierced him, pulling him back to that dusty road outside Raqqa, to Private Ramirez's blood-soaked chest and fading eyes. Elias's throat tightened, but Maya's steady presence and Hope's faint breaths urged him to speak. "So I was just a kid," he began, his voice low, the words emerging like stones from a riverbed. 19, always talking about his sister. Sniper got him center mass. I did everything, pressure, plasma, kept his airway clear, but the blood wouldn't stop. He looked at me, trusted me to save him, and I failed. His last words were, "Tell her I wasn't scared." But he was. I saw it, and I couldn't do anything. Lena moved to sit beside him, close enough that their shoulders brushed, her silence an invitation to continue. "The inquiry said I followed protocol, called it unavoidable," Elias went on, bitterness creeping in. "But I was his corpsman. His life was on me. When I came home I couldn't face that responsibility again, not for anyone. So I pushed you away, pushed everyone away, because it was safer to feel nothing." Thomas's voice broke the pause, soft but resonant. "You carried his death like a chindi, Elias, letting it haunt you. But this dog, this pup, they're showing you the way back." He gestured to Maya and Hope, his eyes warm with understanding. "Your grandmother saw the healer in you, not because you'd never fail, but because you'd keep trying even after loss. That's what Hojo is, finding balance through courage." Elias looked at Maya, her military discipline softened by her devotion to Hope, and felt the truth of Thomas's words. She'd survived abandonment, trauma, and the wild, yet she'd crossed miles to find him, trusting a stranger with her puppy's life. Her tears, her commanding bark during the seizure, were acts of faith that challenged Elias's self-imposed exile. "She didn't give up," he said, his voice steadier now, "even when she had every reason to. I've been hiding from that kind of courage." Lena's hand rested lightly on his arm, a gesture that felt like a bridge to their past. "You're not hiding now," she said. "You're here fighting for them. That's who you are, Elias, the man who doesn't quit even when it hurts." Her words, free of pity, carried a pride that stirred something long dormant in him. He thought of his grandmother's stories, of the holy people who guided lost souls back to balance. Maya's arrival felt like such a guide, her trust a spark, reigniting the healer he'd sworn to abandon. The community's fear, Caleb's guilt, the looming threat of county regulations, they were battles he'd face, not just for Maya and Hope, but for himself. "I don't know if I'm ready to be that man again," he admitted, his gaze on Hope's tiny form. "But I can't let them down, not after what they've given me." Thomas smiled, a glint of approval in his eyes. "The path to healing starts with one step, Elias. You've already taken it." He rose, moving to check on Maya, who leaned into his touch, her trust extending to the elder as if sensing his wisdom. Elias stood, his shoulders squaring as he looked at Lena. "What's next for Hope? And Maya? What do we do to keep them safe?" His voice carried a new resolve, a commitment to protect the bond that had begun to heal him. Lena's expression brightened, her professional focus returning. "Hope needs constant monitoring, more meds I can get from the clinic once the road's clear. Maya needs food, rest, and we need to dig into her past. Find out if she's still military property or free to stay with you. But Elias, she added, her voice softening, you're already doing the most important part, giving them a reason to keep fighting. The cabin felt alive with possibility, its walls no longer a fortress, but a sanctuary where broken spirits could mend. Elias's transformation wasn't complete, but it had begun, fueled by Maya's trust, Hope's resilience, and the quiet strength of Lena and Thomas. The community's conflict loomed, but for the first time Elias felt ready to face it, not as a solitary veteran but as a healer stepping back into his purpose. The desert air hung heavy with the scent of wet sage as dusk settled over Elias. Dawnwalker's cabin, the mist from the day's drizzle giving way to a tentative clearing sky. Inside, the wood stove's glow cast flickering shadows across the room, where Hope, the tiny puppy, slept fitfully in her blanket nest, her breathing steadier but still fragile after her seizure. Maya, the Labrador Retriever, lay curled around. Her hazel eyes alert, her military discipline evident in the subtle tension of her body. Dr. Lena Starbloom packed her medical bag, her movements efficient but weary, while Elder Thomas Yazzie stood by the window, his weathered face thoughtful, as he watched the horizon. The earlier confrontation with Sheriff Martinez and the ranchers had left a simmering unease, but Elias felt a new resolve burning within him, a healer's purpose rekindled by Maya's trust and Hope's fight. The quiet was shattered by the low growl of engines, closer and more determined than before. Elias moved to the window, his heart sinking as he saw Sheriff Martinez's patrol car leading a convoy, 2 pickups and a county animal control van, their headlights cutting through the twilight. "They're back," he said, his voice steady, but edged with steel. Maya rose, her ears pricked, positioning herself between Hope and the door, her posture that of a soldier ready for battle. Lena joined Elias, her expression grim. "They're not here to talk this time," she said, slinging her bag over her shoulder. "We need to be ready." Thomas placed a hand on Elias's shoulder, his voice calm but firm. "The truth will come out, Elias. Stand in your strength and let Hozo guide you." His words, rooted in Navajo wisdom, bolstered Elias as he stepped onto the porch, Maya at his side, her presence a solid anchor. The vehicles parked in a semicircle, their doors opening to reveal Sheriff Martinez, ranchers Bill Torres and his son Caleb, and a uniformed animal control officer. Caleb's rifle was gone, but his sullen expression spoke of defiance, while Bill's face was set with righteous anger. "Elias," Sheriff Martinez began, his Stetson tilted against the evening. "Chill. We've got a county order to remove the dog. Complaints are piling up, missing livestock, folks scared of a military animal running loose. I don't want trouble, but we've got to follow protocol." His tone was measured, but his eyes betrayed a reluctance, as if he hoped for a way. "Out!" Elias squared his shoulders, his hand resting lightly on Maya's head. "She's not a threat, Sheriff. She's a retired military dog, a veteran who saved her puppy's life by bringing her to me. You want to talk protocol? Talk about the .22 bullet we pulled from that pup, a bullet that matches Caleb's rifle." His voice carried the weight of his corpsman days, unflinching in the face of conflict. Bill Torres stepped forward, his face reddening. "You got no proof my boy did anything. That dog's a killer, and you're harboring it on our land." His words sparked a murmur from the animal control officer, who clutched a capture pole, eyeing Maya warily. Lena emerged from the cabin, holding the evidence bag with the bullet fragment. "This is proof," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. .22 caliber, extracted from the puppy. Caleb admitted to shooting at what he thought was a coyote. "You want to talk about threats, Bill? Your son shot a defenseless pup and left her to die." Her clinical tone contrasted with the fire in her eyes, and Caleb flinched, his gaze dropping to the ground. Sheriff Martinez turned to Caleb, his expression hardening. "That true, son? You lied about this." Caleb's defiance crumbled, his voice barely a whisper. "It was an accident. I was out by the creek practicing, saw something move, and I didn't know it was a puppy till after. She ran off, and I was scared the mother would come for me." Tears welled in his eyes, and Bill's anger faltered, replaced by a father's shock. Elias felt a surge of anger, but also a flicker of pity for the boy, whose fear had caused such harm. "You left her to die, Caleb," he said, his voice low but piercing. "But Maya didn't give up. She carried her pup miles to find help, trusted me when she had no reason to trust anyone. That's not a killer. That's a hero." A soft whine from inside drew their attention. Hope had stirred, her tiny form wobbling as she attempted to stand, her bandaged leg trembling. Maya moved instantly, nudging her puppy gently back into the blankets, her maternal care a stark contrast to the accusations outside. The sight silenced the group, even Bill, whose bluster faded as he saw the puppy's fragility. Thomas stepped onto the porch, his presence commanding despite his quiet demeanor. "This land is Dawnwalker's, recognized by treaty," he said, echoing his earlier stance. "But more than that, this dog and her pup are under his protection, as is his right. You speak of fear, but look at her. She protects, she heals, just as Elias does." His words, steeped in Navajo wisdom, seemed to shift the air, grounding the conflict in something larger. Sheriff Martinez removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. "Caleb, you're coming with me. We'll deal with this at the station. Charges, community service, the works." He turned to Elias, his tone softer. "I can hold off the county for now, but you'll need to make this official. Register the dog, get her certified. Something to calm the town. Folks are scared, and fear makes them stubborn." Bill Torres hesitated, then nodded curtly, pulling Caleb toward their truck. The animal control officer retreated, the capture pole unused, and the convoy began to disperse, their headlights fading into the twilight. Elias exhaled, the tension draining from his shoulders, but the weight of the sheriff's warning lingered. The truth about Caleb's actions had diffused the immediate threat, but the community's fear was a smoldering ember, ready to flare again. Lena touched Elias's arm, her eyes warm with pride. "You stood your ground," she said. "For them, and for yourself. That's the Elias I remember." Maya pressed against his leg, her gaze steady, as if affirming her choice in him. Hope's faint wag of her tail from the blanket sealed the moment, a fragile victory in a battle far from over. Elias looked at Thomas, whose smile held the wisdom of the desert. "The truth came out, as you said," Elias acknowledged. "But this isn't the end." "No," Thomas agreed. "It's a beginning. You've chosen to fight for them, Elias. Now you must choose what that fight will build." The words settled into Elias, a call to protect Maya and Hope, to heal the wounds within himself, and to face the community with the courage of a healer, reborn. The desert dawn painted the sky in hues of amber and lavender, the storm's last traces fading into a crisp clarity that made the red rock mesas glow. Elias Dawnwalker stood inside his cabin, the familiar scent of pine and coffee grounding him, as he watched Hope, the tiny puppy, take tentative steps across the floor. Her bandaged leg wobbled, but her tail wagged with a stubborn joy, a testament to her recovery from the seizure and surgery. Maya, the Labrador Retriever, supervised closely, her hazel eyes soft with pride, her military posture relaxed for the first time since her tearful arrival. Dr. Lena Starbloom sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, her medical bag packed but her presence lingering, a bridge to a past Elias was beginning to reclaim. Elder Thomas Yazzie had left at first light, his parting words about Hojo balance still echoing in Elias's mind. The confrontation with the sheriff and ranchers had exposed the truth, but it was the quiet aftermath that felt like a new beginning. Elias knelt beside Hope, offering a gentle scratch behind her ear. "Look at you, little warrior," he murmured, his voice warm with a pride he hadn't felt in years. Her survival, against all odds, was a miracle, but it was Maya's. Trust, those tearful eyes placing her dying pup at his feet, that had cracked open the walls he'd built after Syria. The cabin, once a fortress of solitude, now hummed with life, its walls bearing witness to a transformation Elias was only beginning to understand. Lena set down her mug, her expression a mix of professional satisfaction and something deeper, a cautious hope. "Hope's recovery is remarkable," she said, watching the puppy nudge Maya's muzzle. "No seizures in 12 hours, wound healing cleanly. She's a fighter, like her mum." Her eyes met Elias's, and she added, "And like you. You didn't just save her, Elias. You gave Maya a reason to keep going, too." The words settled into him, stirring the healer's purpose he'd buried after Private Ramirez's death. He thought of Thomas's wisdom, of his grandmother's belief in his gift, and felt a shift, a willingness to step back into that role, not just for Maya and Hope, but for himself. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said, his voice steady. "Or Thomas. You both saw something in me I'd forgotten." Lena's smile was small but genuine, a flicker of their old connection. "Maybe we just remembered who you are." She hesitated, then pulled a folder from her bag. "I did some digging last night, called a contact at Lackland Air Force Base. Maya's a retired military working dog, ID number confirmed. She was slated for adoption after her handler's death, but there was an administrative error. Her records were misfiled and she ended up at a shelter. She escaped 10 months ago, likely living wild until she found you." Elias's hand rested on Maya's head, her warmth a steady anchor. "Escaped and found me," he repeated, the improbability of it sinking in. "How I never worked with her unit in Syria." Lena's expression softened, a hint of discomfort crossing her face. "When you came back, you sent me your old corpsman jacket. I kept it, and when I volunteered at the shelter, I let Maya sleep with it. Her PTSD was bad. Familiar scents helped. She must have associated your scent with safety." The revelation hit Elias like a quiet thunderclap. Lena had kept his jacket, used it to comfort a traumatized dog, even after he'd pushed her away. "You saved her before I even knew her," he said, the words heavy with gratitude. "Thank you, Lena." She nodded, looking away to hide the emotion in her eyes. "She's yours now, legally. Lackland's records show she was discharged, so no one's coming for her. But you should register her as your service dog. PTSD programs for veterans are perfect for dogs like Maya. It'll protect her from the county and the town's fears." Elias considered the suggestion, his old resistance to labels like wounded. Veteran flaring briefly, but Maya's steady gaze, her unwavering trust silenced his doubts. She'd chosen him, crossed miles to find him, and in doing so had given him a purpose he'd thought lost. "I'll do it," he said, his voice firm. "For her, and for Hope. They're staying with me." Thomas's earlier departure had come with a promise to return, but his influence lingered in the form of a small bundle of sage he'd left on the table, a reminder of the healing path Elias was reclaiming. Lena stood gathering her things. "I'll check on Hope tomorrow, bring more meds, but you've got this, Elias, you're already their healer." Her words carried a pride that warmed him, a step toward reconciliation not just with her, but with the man he was becoming. As Lena prepared to leave, Elias heard a faint scratch at the door. He opened it to find a note tucked under the mat, written in Thomas's careful hand. "The circle is complete when you honor the gift given. Start the program, Elias. Veterans and dogs, healing together." The words sparked an idea that had been forming since the crisis. A training center for retired military dogs and indigenous veterans, a place of mutual healing. He tucked the note into his pocket, a seed planted for the future. Outside, the desert stretched under the clearing sky, its beauty a stark contrast to the conflict that had threatened to tear this sanctuary apart. Elias looked at Maya, who'd followed him to the porch, Hope wobbling behind her, her puppy curiosity outweighing her weakness. The community's fear wasn't gone, but Caleb's confession and the sheriff's restraint had bought time. Elias felt a lightness he hadn't known since before Syria, a sense that he was no longer alone in his fight. Maya and Hope, Lena's expertise, Thomas's wisdom. They were his circle now, a new beginning forged in trust and resilience. He knelt beside Maya, bringing himself to her level. "Ready for a new mission, soldier?" he asked, his voice soft but certain. Maya pressed her muzzle against his shoulder, a gesture that needed no translation. Hope nuzzled his hand, her tiny tongue flicking out, and Elias smiled, the weight of his past easing, replaced by the promise of a future he was ready to build. A year had passed since the storm that brought Maya and Hope to Elias Dawnwalker's doorstep, and the high desert of northern Arizona bloomed with the quiet resilience of spring. The red rock mesas glowed under a midday sun, their edges softened by patches of wildflowers that had taken root after the monsoons. Elias stood on a rise overlooking his cabin, now flanked by a new structure, a low adobe building with a sign reading Dawnwalker Healing Center, Veterans and Dogs. The air carried the scent of sage and the distant bark of dogs at play, a sound that filled Elias with a peace he'd once thought impossible. Maya, her golden coat gleaming, stood at his side, her hazel eyes scanning the horizon, her military posture tempered by the ease of a dog who'd found her home. Hope, no longer a fragile puppy but a spirited young Labrador, chased a butterfly nearby, her once bandaged leg now strong, her torn ear a badge of survival. Elias adjusted the leash clipped to Maya's collar, a formality for their latest mission. The call had come at dawn, a hiker lost in the canyonlands caught in a sudden storm. Sheriff Martinez, now a cautious ally, had requested Elias and Maya's help. Their tracking skills honed through months of training with the Healing Center's program. Maya's military background, once a point of fear for the town, was now a source of pride, her service dog certification ensuring her place at Elias's side. As they prepared to join the search, Elias felt the weight of the past year settle into a quiet gratitude. A full circle from the man who'd hidden from his pain to one who'd embraced his purpose. The Healing Center had been Lena Starbloom's idea, sparked by Thomas Yazzy's note and Elias's growing vision. Together, they'd built a sanctuary for indigenous veterans and retired military dogs, a place where trauma was met with trust and healing came through connection. Lena, now a partner in both the program and Elias's life, had secured grants and trained the first cohort of handlers, her veterinary expertise guiding the dog's care. Thomas served as a cultural advisor, weaving Navajo teachings into the program, his stories of Hojo inspiring veterans to find balance through their bonds with their dogs. The center's first success was Caleb Torres, the teen whose reckless shot had wounded Hope. After community service and counseling, he'd joined the program, pairing with a retired Belgian Malinois, his guilt transformed into a commitment to make amends. Elias glanced at Hope, who'd abandoned her butterfly chase, to romp toward the center, where Lena was leading a training session. The community had changed too. The rancher's fear had faded as Maya's heroism became legend, her tracking missions and gentle demeanor winning hearts. Bill Torres had donated land for the center's expansion, a gesture of reconciliation after Caleb's confession. Sheriff Martinez kept the county at bay, ensuring Maya and Hope faced no further threats. The town now saw Elias not as a reclusive veteran, but as a healer, his scar a mark of survival rather than shame. As Elias and Maya set out for the search, the Yauti desert stretched before them, its vastness no longer a refuge from the world, but a canvas for their shared mission. Maya's nose twitched, already catching scents on the breeze, her training as sharp as ever. Elias carried a pack with supplies, his old corpsman instincts alive in every step. The hiker, a young woman named Sarah, was found by mid-afternoon, dehydrated but alive, huddled in a canyon wash. Maya's keen senses had led them to her, her bark echoing triumphantly as Elias offered water and a blanket. Sarah's tearful gratitude mirrored Maya's own tear-streaked arrival a year ago, a reminder of the trust that had changed everything. Back at the center that evening, Elias sat on the porch, Maya at his feet, Hope sprawled beside her, chewing, a stick with puppyish glee. Lena joined him, her hand finding his, their fingers intertwining with the ease of a rekindled bond. "You did good out there," she said, her voice warm with pride. "Sarah's family called. They want to meet Maya, maybe even volunteer here." Elias smiled, his gaze on the desert horizon, where the last light painted the mesas gold. "None of this would have happened without her," he said, nodding to Maya. "Or Hope. They brought me back, Lena, back to who I was supposed to be." He thought of Private Ramirez, the ghost who'd haunted him for years. The pain was still there, but it no longer defined him. Instead, it fueled his work. Each veteran and dog he helped a step toward honoring Ramirez's memory and his grandmother's prophecy. Thomas arrived, his jeep pulling up as the stars began to emerge. He carried a small bundle of sage, a ritual, offering for the center's growing circle. "The holy people are pleased," he said, his eyes twinkling as he watched Hope pounce on a leaf. "You've built something sacred here, Elias, a place where spirits mend. His words sealed the moment, a full circle from the solitary man Elias had been to the healer he'd become. As night fell, Elias lit the sage, its smoke curling skyward, carrying prayers of gratitude. Maya pressed against his leg, hope nestled close, and Lena's hand stayed in his. The desert sang its quiet song, crickets, wind, the distant howl of a coyote, and Elias felt the weight of his past lift, replaced by the lightness of a future built on trust, resilience, and love. Maya's tearful journey had led them here, to a sanctuary where broken spirits found home, and Elias knew with a certainty that felt like Hoju that they would keep fighting, together, for as long as the desert endured.